Okay, so last week we continued on Daf Mem Zayin Amid Beis on a new portion of the Mishnah from Mem Daled. So we're continuing through the Mishnah, but the one discussion that we had that we kind of left a little bit open was the discussion about Ono, and I said that I would look up some of the halachas so that we could talk just a little bit about Ono, the concept that that if you overcharge or the buyer underpays by a sixth, more than a sixth, I should say, then you have to repay, and the whole transaction can be nullified. There's a lot to say on that. It's a whole big sugya, and I'm not going to take a whole shiur to talk about it. But the way we left it, I said I would take a look halacha lemaisa, because remember the Gemara makes a distinction by saying that from the pasuk that we have in Vayikra, v'chisimkru mimkala misecha o kona miyad misecha, or you remember the word miyad. So we focused on the word miyad. It says if you sell to your fellow man, or you buy from the hand of your fellow man. So there's a whole discussion about what this word yad amisecha, and there's a machlokes, what we learn out of it. So we talked about that last week. But the ikar question, the main question, is halacha lemaisa: is there ono by karka? Now, because it says yad, and we interpret yad to mean metaltalin, which makes sense. Is there ono by karka? So let me take a few minutes to talk about that, because it's a fascinating discussion, and it's a discussion that many of the Rishonim weigh in. I mean, we have an elaborate Ramban, we have a Rambam, we have, of course, the Minchas Chinuch Halacha talks about in Sefer HaMitzvos. So there's a lot to talk about. So what I want to just point out, so that we understand the halacha, there are two halachas here. There are two separate halachas involved. The pasuk that we read from Vayikra, v'chisimkeru, that's a lav. That means that if you overcharge by more than a sixth, or the buyer underpays by more than a sixth, you're over a lav of oinah. It's a lav in the Torah. Are there teeth to it? That's a different question. So in other words, you're over the lav, and that lav you're over regardless of whether it's metaltalin or karka. You can be over the lav by metaltalin, and you can be over the lav by karka. So that if you sell someone a piece of land and you charge him more than a sixth of what the land objectively is worth, that's oino min haTorah, and you're over a lav. Now, separate question, what do we do about it? That's the whole discussion, which makes it so fascinating, is that's called tashlumim. That's called paying. Now you got to pay up. There's a big difference between metaltalin and karka. Metaltalin, there is tashlumim, meaning that you do have to pay. This is halacha lemaisa, that you have to pay the difference. In other words, if it's less than a sixth, no, we vitiated. No, nothing happened. If it's a sixth, he has to pay, but the deal is still intact. If it's more than a sixth, either way, buyer or seller, then you have to pay, and the deal can be undone. In other words, the deal is now susceptible to being canceled. If it's just a sixth, it's not canceled, you just pay. But if you have it more than a sixth, then it is cancelable. You don't have to, but it can be canceled. So the halacha is like this. In tashlumim is only by metaltalin. Tashlumim is not by karka. So we're bifurcating the halacha here, and we're saying that you're over a lav, regardless of whether you metaltalin or karka. But when it comes to paying, the only payment requirement is by metaltalin, not by karka. Now, how does that make sense? Okay, so there's a very extensive Ramban that talks about this. And what's fascinating is that the pasuk of Oinah is in the context of Yovel. Yovel is karka. The whole Indian of Yovel is that karka goes back, land, right? Land expires in the 50th year. So what's now? Think about this. What's the seichel if the whole Indian of Oinah is by Yovel, and the principle of Yovel is by karka, and you're telling me that by karka there's no tashlumim? I mean, it just doesn't seem to hang together. Why would it be just by karka? It should be maybe by something having to do with metaltalin, and then you can say, okay, there's tashlumim, meaning you have to pay up, and it makes sense. So here's the seichel. It's a very interesting discussion. So the Ramban says as follows. He says, yes, it's by Yovel, but think about this for a minute. In Klal Yisrael, historically, right? Eretz Yisrael is an agrarian society. It was an agricultural society, meaning that it was set up that of course it was great nisim, but it's about the land. It's about producing from the land. It's about the bracha from the land. The Rebbe Shem gave us land, and he gave us the bracha that we would be able to enhance the land and make great things happen. If you are stringent in the halacha of tashlumim with regard to land, says the Ramban, what you may wind up doing is upending the whole system that Klal Yisrael was based on. Because if you're going to say that every time there is an incident where someone overpays, let's say, for land, and you're going to undo it, that may, in real world, undo the whole agrarian society. Says the Ramban, therefore, most people, and he's doing it al pi seichel, most people will be mavate. They'll not make a big deal about overpaying because they know in the long run it's all about the land. Okay, so I overpaid by more than a sixth. It's not the end of the world. I need that land. That land is what is going to produce in the future, many times over. So I'll look away. I'm not going to make a big deal. If it's just you and I, and you overcharge me, I would say to you, it's not right. You overcharged me. You should reimburse. Okay, so we understand that between two people in Mekach and Memker in commerce, that's a normal thing. You overcharge me, you should repay me. But when it comes to land, says the Ramban, it's so critical in the life of Klal Yisrael, of every person, that if a person makes a transaction, even if he's overpaid, he's not going to make a big issue about it, because nevertheless, that's the lifeblood of the community. That's the Ramban Seichel. That's why he says there's no tashlumim by land, because there's an Isser of Oinah, and you're still over the lav, right? You're still over the lav. So if you're over the lav and you want to sort of purify yourself from being over the lav, then you do the right thing. But can we press you for tashlumim? No, we're not going to press you for tashlumim. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, there is no tashlumim by karka, al pi halacha, because the halacha takes into consideration the practical effects of making tashlumim a part of the sort of the whole process. So, and this is what's interesting. So we separate the process. We said there is an Isser v'heter Isser. And by the way, there's a whole discussion about Isser v'heter here. Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. We paskin like Rav and Isser v'heter. We paskin like Shmuel and Mominis. So therefore, we say that according to Rav, there is really an Isser in Oinah. But Lamaisa, we paskin like Shmuel, that there is no payment. So this, again, you can give a whole shiur on this, but I really wanted to sort of close the loop because we talked about it last week, so that we should understand that this discussion of Oinah goes far deeper than just that. In our Gemara, we just touch on it. In other Gemaras, Oinah becomes the central topic, but I wanted all of us to understand And when I started looking into this, I realized how detailed and complicated this whole Isser of Hano was. Yeah, Michael.
So, Rabbi, if the buyer who paid more than a sixth
Yeah.
goes to Beis Din and during the time of Beis Din and says, I paid more than the sixth, I want to cancel the transaction, even though because that's the halacha, can he go and do that?
No. He cannot cancel the transaction. And again, we
get a refund for the differential to get to
again, that now becomes, it's not mandatory. Can he? Yes. I mean, if the seller says, you know what, I really realized there was a mistake here, or if it's an underpayment, depending on which side of the aisle the transaction happened, could have been an underpayment or an overpayment, but it's not halachically required. Yes, the parties can say, yeah, we want to do the right thing, but al pi halacha, and that's what we were saying. I want to understand, what does the halacha say about that? The halacha says that you're over the Isser of Oinah, but there's no tashlumim. And the reason there's no tashlumim is because in the overall process, people would not be as makbid about land as they would be about metaltalin. You and I might individually be makbid. We might be more particular because if it's a big amount of money, it could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. 1/6 is a lot of money. Again, you transport yourself back to the time of the Torah when people when there was a yovel, and in other words, so people would be taken advantage of because they would be paying a higher price and only getting a few years to do the work. That's the context in which I know it comes up, is because let's say you're in the 47th year and you're going to go ahead and buy this land, right, or do a long-term lease on the land or whatever it is, and you're going to have 3 years left and then it's gone, and you're going to pay a hefty price for those 3 years, and then all of a sudden you're going to lose the land. That's where the context comes in of Oinah in Karka. And that's the
presumably the buyer and seller factor that into the price that's charged.
Maybe they did. No, exactly. If they factored it in, but let's say the buyer was ignorant and he didn't know, and he said, "Oh, this is a wonderful piece of land. I'm going to pay you all this money," and then later realizes, "Oh my gosh, I only have the use of 3 years. What did I do here?" Right? So, but again, it's interesting because we have to think about this from the position of the people in Eretz Yisrael at the time, is that without land, land was your lifeblood, because it was, I mean, how else did you take care of yourself if you didn't have land to produce crops and to sell and to have food? There was no industrial society in Eretz Yisrael. It was all agrarian. So therefore land, you couldn't be too harsh, says the Ramban, and make it so that the deal automatically falls apart, is because land is the lifeblood of what was Klal Yisrael. That's how the Ramban looks at it, and it seems like the Rambam and others also touch on this, and that's what when I started looking at it, it led me from one to the other. I saw that there was a lot of discussion, but halacha lemaisa, there is an Isser of Oinah on Karka and on metaltalin, but when it comes to tashlumim, to actual paying, the requirement is only by metaltalin, not by karka. That's the
Rabbi,
yeah.
Rabbi Shalom presumably knew all this when he put the Isser in the
right
chapter on in Bahar on the land.
Right.
So the Ramban's explanation is all based on the rabbi's authority to modify the law to make society operate in a practical way.
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. Look, we have this constantly, like last week. I don't know if you're here, David, but in our discussion here, we had this big machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish as to what is kaina. Rabbi Yochanan says kesef is kaina, and Rish Lakish says meshicha is kaina. Rabbi Yochanan says kesef is kaina, but the rabbis can institute, notwithstanding that you have to have meshicha. But it says kesef is kaina. But there's a practical reason why the rabbi said you have to have Mashiach, because if you didn't have Mashiach, then maybe the seller, if he sells it and gets his money, he's going to say, I got my money. I don't have to worry about the chayfetz. The chayfetz could be on fire. I'm not going to protect it because it's not mine. It belongs to the buyer. Why should I protect it? I already got my money. So from a practical standpoint, the rabbis have always looked at what does the Torah say, and in its purest form. But wait a minute. But how do we adjust ourselves for different circumstances? That's why they come up with the fact that it's Mashiach Midrabanan. Rosh Lakish, of course, says Mashiach is Midaraisa. But just as an example, to your point, yes, that the Torah says that this is what we should do. The rabbis, when it comes as a practical matter, and again, we say that they have the spirit of the Torah, right? They have Yerushalayim, they have the spirit of the Torah, so that they have the ability to take a doraisa and say, you know what, we have to modify that a little bit because it's too, I don't know, too stringent, too harsh, not harsh, whatever the case may be. And we have to modify it a little bit and add a twist. And we have that in our halacha today. When it comes to Shabbos and many halachas, we know that there are siyagim, the Rabbanan have made all kinds of siyagim to our halachas to protect us from an Issa D'Oraisa, right? In other words, sometimes we'll get too close to the edge, right? I mean, a perfect example is Shkia. Right, Shkia. If you have Shabbos, so we have something called, we have a buffer. So we say we have 18 minutes. Okay, what does that mean? 18. What do you do in 18 minutes? The teretz is that if you are Mekabel Shabbos before the Shkia, then you'll know you're not going to be over a lav d'oraisa. All right, so that's a rabbinic institution to protect Klal Yisrael. Many others that the rabbis have in business and in other aspects of life, where they create that kind of a siyag, and we use it for our own protection. Now, many sort of skirt that and say, "Well, I'm not over an Issa D'Oraisa. I'm okay." I mean, technically, you're right, but this is why we have this is why we have the rabbis helping us get along in society. All right. So that's and if there's any other questions, that's the whole inyan of Oino, the halacha l'maisa. But there's a practical reason why Oino is not applying to karka, and therefore the interpretation of that pasuk when it says Okona miyada misecha really does refer to metaltalin, because that's where we have most of our discussion. Okay. So last week we finished to the wide lines at the bottom of Mem Zayin Omid Beis, and again we're now at the point where we're each sugya we're going back to the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah in Mem Dalid Omid Aleph. What did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah told us that okay. Okay, then we talked about we're going to talk about the Mishapara. That Mishapara, the Mishnah told us, and we understood that the Mishapara was not an Isser, but it was an admonition that if you make a deal and you back out from the deal, not to the Rebbeinu Shalom's liking. And that's what we said, these terrible things that happen in the Dora Mabul, Dora Maflaga, also lahafriya will happen to you, which is why, and again, we're going to talk about Omid Bidvaro in more detail. Words matter. Words matter. If you make a deal, then you shouldn't be cavalier about breaking a deal. Now, there are times when the deal doesn't really stick, and you can say, okay, but I'm allowed to do this. And we're going to see there are situations where you can do it, and there is not a mishapara, there is not a stringent admonition of punishment. But in the norm, a Jew should not cavalierly enter into a deal that he'll later say, no, oops, sorry, no deal. That's not. Now, interestingly, in our civil law, there are states where oral contracts are valid. And then there are states where they're not valid. So that becomes a locale issue. It's called the statute of frauds, that you're not allowed to say something orally, which how you're going to prove it, and therefore it's going to create a problem later on because you're accused of having made a deal, but where's the proof? So that's a big issue in civil law. Al pi halacha, we'll see that where that applies or not. So that's really one of the points we're going to discuss. And then after the Mishapara in the Mishnah, Rav Shimon Omer, that was the last part of the Mishnah. Rav Shimon says, "Kol shakesef biyada yada al yona." After everything is said and done, we had the discussion about whether money is kona or whether a chayfetz is kona, and we had all these discussions. Says Rav Shimon in his last words of the Mishnah. But keep in mind that at the end of the day, let's look at who has the money. The person who has the money is Yoda al Yona. He's in the best position. And Rashi says, Pligi ad Rabbanon. I'm reading from the Rashi in the Mishnah on Mem Daled. Pligi ad Rabbanon de'omer nosel omos yochel lachzabo afil lo keach. According to the Rabbanon, that if money was transacted but not the chayfetz, then the whole deal is retractable. Because why? Money doesn't make the kinyan. That's the main principle of the Mishnah, is that only a chayfetz, the transfer of the chayfetz of the actual produce, is what locks in the deal, not the money. Comes Rab Shimon and says, also Rab Shimon lamema moichesh akol biyado. The seller who has the money, who yachal lachzabo, he has the money, but he can retract. But the lokeach can't retract. So Rab Shimon disputes on the Rabbanon, and that's what we're going to discuss here, and says, you know what? The guy who's got the money, he's really the one who's in control. So even though the rabbis say that money doesn't lock in a deal, says Rab Shimon, if the seller who has the money wants to lock in the deal, he can lock in the deal. If he doesn't want to lock in the deal, he can void the deal. But the buyer can't, he has no control. So in other words, it's Yada al Yona, meaning that he controls the deal, which is very different from what we've said in the Tanakama. And the principle of our Mishnah is that money does not lock in the deal and produce locks in the deal. Here we see Rab Shimon says money locks in the deal if the seller wants to. But if he doesn't want to, then it doesn't lock in the deal. That's a whole different view of this. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit further. So it changes sort of the whole mindset of what we've been talking about until now. Okay, so now let's go into the Gemara. Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, Rab Shimon Omer kol shekesa biyada yada al yona. His hand is the upper hand. Mochu demotza hodabe lokeach lamotza hodabe. Okay, so the mocher can retract according to Rab Shimon, but the buyer can't retract. And again, that flies in the face of everything we've said of the Tanakama of the Rabbanan, who say that according to the Tanakama, everybody should be able to retract because the money didn't make the deal stick. That's the principle of the Chachamim. Says the Gemara, I amrit bishloma mos konos. If you remember, there's a machlokes between Rav Yochanan and Rosh Lakish. Is mos konos midaraisa or is not kona midaraisa? Rabbi Yochanan says mos konos midaraisa. Rosh Lakish says no, meshicha, and we saw it from that pasuk in Vayikra. Meshicha is kona midaraisa, not mos. That's the absolute machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rosh Lakish. Says the Gemara, Bishloime, if you hold I amid bishloime mos konos, if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan that mos konos mishum hachi mocha motza hodabe lokech lamotza hodabe. Perfectly understandable. According to Rabbi Yochanan, mos is konos. There was money that transacted here, but not a chayfetz. The mocher can then say, I have my money, the deal's done. But if I don't want it to be done, I can undo it. But it makes perfect sense why, according to him, he's Yod al-Yona, and the Lokeach has no control because he's paid the money. Remember, in Rabbi Yochanan's view, money is midoraisa, right? So since the money was handed over, the Lokeach, the buyer, is given up every right to undo the transaction. That's what we mean by Yod al-Yona, that the mocher is the one who controls the deal. Okay. But if you say in Rabbi that Mos Einakonis, and as if you don't hold like Rabbi Yochanan, Lokeach nami lahadabe, then the Lokeach should also be able to undo. In other words, this is a raya to Rabbi Yochanan. This particular, our Mishnah is a raya, according to Rabbi Shimon, is proof positive that Rabbi Yochanan is correct, because Rabbi Yochanan says that money can be koneh, and Rish Lakish says no, but and the Gemara says that only the seller can undo the transaction. That's proof that Rabbi Yochanan is right, that money is koneh, the mocher can undo the transaction, the lokeach cannot undo the transaction, and then we're fine and good. So that's the raya that the Gemara wants to bring from Reb Shimon, from these words of Reb Shimon, that Rabbi Yochanan is correct. Remember, Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish was later on. They're arguing as to whether or not money is koneh or not, and we'll bring proof from the Mishnah that Rabbi Yochanan is right. What's the proof? The proof is that Reb Shimon says that Yod al-Yona, that the mocher has the money, his hand is the upper hand, because he controls the deal. If you don't hold like Rabbi Yochanan, he doesn't control the deal. So therefore, at this stage, right now in our discussion, Rabbi Yochanan, according to the Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan has we hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that Mos konos. Right? Okay, that's well. Now we're going to flip to the other side, which we've done continuously, and we're going to say, wait a minute, what about Rish Lakish? Rish Lakish is the one who says Mos is not konos. He says Meshicha is minadaraisa, not Ma'os. Then we ask the question, Amalei Rish Lakish, Ali B'Rab Shimon Lo Ka'amina. I have nothing to say according to Rab Shimon, because Rab Shimon says that the mocher is al Yona. So what is there to say? There's nothing for me to say. He disagrees with my premise, says Rish Lakish, that Mashiach is koneh, right? Ki ka'amina. When did I, Rish Lakish, say my svara that Mashiach is koneh midaraisa ali b'derabanan? Only according to the rabbis, according to the rabbi's view. So bishloim Rish Lakish hanadika ben Reb Shimon l'Rabbanan. Now, according to Rish Lakish, there is we understand the machlokes between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanan. According to Reb Shimon, Mos is konos, and according to the Rabbanan, Mos is not konos because you have to have Mashiach. Ela Rabbi Yochanan ma'ike ben Reb Shimon l'Rabbanan. According to Rabbi Yochanan, if Rabbi Yochanan's view is the accurate view that Mos konos, what's the machlokes in the Mishnah between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanan? There is no machlokes, because everybody would have to hold that Mos konos. Even the Rabbanan would have to hold that. In other words, the kasha here is, we know there's a machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon. We know that in the Mishnah. Okay, now the Gemara comes and wants to understand the underlying principle of when a deal is done. So we bring up the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, and we say it's all dependent on whether or not Mos is konos midaraisa or whether Mashiach is koneh midaraisa. Okay, fine. But now let's bring that back into the machlokes of the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon, and the Gemara says accurately, if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, if you hold like Rish Lakish, then I understand the machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon. But if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, what's the machlokes? Where is the machlokes in the Mishnah? We kept saying that there's a machlokes in the Mishnah between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon. What's the machlokes? If we're going to say that Mos is konos, that money is koina, then even the Rabbanim will say that money is kona, because Rabbi Yochanan's principle will be a principle that will be applied to everybody. So then the Gemara's kasha basically is, I don't understand the machlokes between the Tanakama and Rab Shimon if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan that Mos is konos. Okay, we'll look at Rashi, but that's basically the Gemara's kasha now, is you want to reconcile the Mishnah. How do you reconcile the Mishnah if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan that Mos is konos? Okay, so let's look at Rashi about the middle of the page. I Amrit Bishloma Dvar Torah Mos Konos. This is Rabbi Yochanan's principle. If you hold the Dvar Torah Midaraisa Mos Konos U'Mashicha Tekanta the Rabbanon he, and Mashicha is only a Tekana of the Rabbanon. Also, Rab Shimon Lemeimar comes Rab Shimon and he says, Dine Ardin Imamrin Chazara B'Moicha the Mochem Mukmas Leber Shusei Lachzabo Im Hukru. In other words, okay, so what is, if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan that Mos is konos, what do the rabbis come to add in Mashicha? The rabbis want to tell us in Mashicha that no, you have to have Mashicha to protect the buyer. Why? Because if you're going to say Mos konos and the seller has his money, then he's not going to want to further protect the property. And therefore, if something happens to the property, a fire or something, he's going to say, not my problem. I have the deed is done. And now the buyer is on his own. So Rashi here is telling us something different. No, the Mashicha that the rabbis instituted is for the benefit of the seller, not just the buyer, but the seller. Why? Because if the seller realizes that Mashicha is also required, then he will have the latitude of undoing the deal if the item that was transacted goes up in price. Let's say he buys an item and all of a sudden the value of that item goes up tremendously in price. If the deal is done and he has his money, even if the buyer didn't take the chayfetz, he's out of luck, because that chayfetz, the price increase was all in the possession of the buyer. So all of a sudden he'll lose out a lot of money in the fact that he gave up this possession. He still has it in his reshus, but it's no longer his. Comes Reb Shimon and he says, you know what? Midrabanan Mashicha is required, which means not only will the seller protect the property on behalf of the buyer, he'll protect the property on his own behalf. Because if the price skyrockets, he can come back and say, you know what? You need Mashicha. It didn't happen. I'm undoing the deal. Now my chayfetz is mine. That chayfetz that's in my possession that really maybe technically belongs to you is really mine, because you didn't do Mashicha. Because Mashicha is required according to Reb Shimon, according to the Rabbanan in Rish Lakish. So now we have a different way of looking at the whole inyan. It's not just the seller protecting the buyer, which, okay, yes, no, he's protecting himself, because by and large, he has the latitude to undo the deal if the price goes up, so he can hedge against that by saying, you know what, the rabbis required Mashicha, you didn't do Mashicha, I'm undoing the deal. That's what Rashi is telling us. So again, Mashicha tekanta Rabbanani, also Rab Shimon Lemeimer, Dainu the din, Imarminan Chazara b'mocher. If we say that there is Chazara, in other words, the seller can undo the B'chi Mukmas Leber Shusei Lachsabo, he has it in his reshus Lachsabo to return it im hukru. If it goes up in value, Mosa Nashe, he will put himself out, La'atzlinu, to save it, Meima Ama Adayin Schori Toli Bohem. If it goes up in price, I will return it. In other words, it'll be mine. But the lokeach is stymied from undoing the deal. Why the most konos? In other words, he'll have the best of both worlds. But if you hold that most enakonos, like Rosh Lakish, that you have to have Mashiach midiraisa, then it's an equal playing field, and the lokeach can also undo the deal. So now we look at this whole situation a little bit differently than we did before. And the whole point here, if you say Dvar Torah mos konos, then the lokeach really is, he has the advantage of mos konos, but he also has the advantage of, since the rabbis instituted Mashiach, that he can hedge against mos konos and say, I'm undoing the deal. So in Rabbi Yochanan, it's the mocher who wins every which way, because he's the one who can say the deal is done, or he's the one who can say the deal is not done. I want to back out of the deal, right? Alibid Rab Shimon vadin lo kamina. The Rab Shimon svirle Mashiach tekanta rabbanani, because Rab Shimon says that the Mashiach is a tekanta rabbanon. So midaraisa for sure you can't undo. Ki kamina alibid rabbanon. The only way that Rosh Lakish's view can have any shaykhis or any traction is a libid rabbanon. The Amar lokeach nami chose mishum demos enakonos klal, because according to in this view, the lokeach is totally independent of the mocher, and he can undo the deal unilaterally. So therefore, since Mashiach is required, according to Rosh Lakish, and he didn't make Mashiach, now it's an equal playing field between the seller and the buyer, because either one can back out. Remember, according to Rabbi Yochanan, only the seller has the control to back out, and that's what Rabbi Shimon means Yada al Halyona, because he totally controls the deal. But according to Rosh Lakish, you can't say Yada al Elyona, because according to Rosh Lakish, Mashiach is midaraisa, and therefore the buyer has equal rights to back out, just like the seller. So again, what the Gemara is trying to present to us is that the machlokes in the Mishnah between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon is wholly dependent on whether you take the view of Rabbi Yochanan or to take the view of Rosh Lakish. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no chiluk between the two. According to Rosh Lakish, there is a chiluk. So that's the kasha on the Mishnah. How can you learn Rabbi Yochanan in the Mishnah? Because there is no machlokes between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon, and our Mishnah does have a machlokes between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon. It has to be Rosh Lakish's view. That's what the Gemara's kasha is right now. Is Reb Lakish is the correct interpreter of the Mishnah, because according to him, there's a distinction between Reb Shimon and the Tanakama. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there's no distinction between Reb Shimon and the Tanakama. Okay, so Rashi says further, the Ika ben Reb Shimon Rabbanan Klomer, Bahai Pligi, Bahai Tam Yavul Milsa the Rabbanan Savra Mashiach Daraisa, according to Rosh Lakish, V'hilkach Lo Shana Moicher Lo Shana Lokeach Matzahadre. Either of them can back out because there was no Mashiach at this point. Rab Shimon Savar Mashiach Takanta de Rabbanan. Rab Shimon says Mashiach is only a Takonas Rabbanan. Mishum the Nitrach Bahu. In other words, to salvage the property, because the seller will want to preserve the property for himself in case it goes up in price, right? Hilkach Lamochahu, the Ovid Rabbanan Takanta, the Lahada Valolokeach. According to Rabbi Yochanan, it's only to protect the mocher that Rish Lakish gives his view, and not to protect the buyer. So then again, that's the stark contrast. Ella Rabbi Yochanan Amal Rabbanan Ami Meshicha Takanta Rabbanan He My Ika Ben Rab Shimon Rabbanan, says Rashi. What is now the difference between in Rabbi Yochanan? What's the difference Rab Shimon and the Rabbanan? Klomar. But my kamifligi, and what are they arguing? Umatam Nosel Devrayim. How do you explain the machlokes? There is no machlokes, and yet when we learned the Mishnah, we said there's a clear-cut machlokes between the Tanakama and Rab Shimon. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no machlokes. That's really he's repeating himself, but that's really the kasha. Okay, therefore the Rabbanan said no, Meshicha midoraisa is to protect the lokeach. Lachzabo b'shvil osa takana atzma, that because of the takana that the Rabbanan instituted, the buyer can now retract, right? Denisrafu chatecha, because in other words, to protect him from the fact that his produce may burn. The kolchkein ki mekomos lachzor namre b'shus lokeach. That there will be institute times where the seller will be Maisa Nafshe Umatzel Sheim Yira Halokeach Delika Bar Yoma Hachsereni Bi. This is fascinating because if, in other words, we may have a circumstance where the parties made the transaction, the seller saying, "Okay, I have the money, the deal is done," and then the parties look and say, "Oh my gosh, there's a fire in the property. The properties are going to up in smoke." And what will the buyer say? I retract. I immediately retract. So that fire will consume the property, and it'll be in the seller's rishus, not the buyer's rishus. So that again, it's maybe highly unlikely, but he's giving you an example of where the seller may be sort of at a loss, because the buyer, if he has that opportunity to be machzir, will be in control by saying, I want to retract. The fire is about to consume the property. I didn't make Mashicha. I'm retracting. You lose, seller, because it's your property. It's in your rishus. I didn't take it. You lose. Again, so this is the answer why it's incumbent on the seller to protect the property, A, because there shouldn't be a fire which the buyer can then retract, or because the property will go up in value and he'll be the beneficiary. So again, the Gemara is telling us in every circumstance, the seller is on his guard to protect the property and not sort of be cavalier and say, I have my money, it's yours, because he may wind up being the loser. So that's how the Gemara is positing the deal, and the Gemara and Rashi says here at the very bottom, and we're going to see that in the later daf. Okay, we're going to do Rav Chizda Gabehu Diyav Zuze Achamra Shema Deboy Lemisnave Debe Pruzak Milchel V'Hadabe. Okay, we'll talk about that Gemara later, but basically it's another circumstance where be careful what you wish for, because if you're going to say, I have my deal, I'm comfortable, and the rest of the rechayos is yours, it may backfire on you, and there will be, as again, in the instance where there's a fire, and it's the seller who's going to take the loss, not the buyer. Okay, so that's how the Gemara wants to answer. So let's go back to, okay, so that's the Gemara now. So so we're back to the Kasha. So how do you understand Rabbi Yochanan in our Mishnah? There is no machlokes in our Mishnah between Rab Shimon and the Tanakama. So what's the machlokes? According to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the mocher is in control here. And so the Gemara says, Ika Benaya, 5 lines from the bottom. Ika Benaya, you know what the chilik is between Rab Shimon and the Rabbanim? Ika Benaya de Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda's interpretation of the Gemara is what is the chiluk between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. What does it mean? The Amar Rav Chizda says, Kederach shetiknu meshicha b'mochrin, tach tiknu meshicha b'lekuchais. So just as there is meshicha by the seller. There's also Mashicha by the buyer. What does that mean? So the Gemara says that, in other words, he's basically putting his imprimatur on what Rish Lakish says, that just as the seller is in control when he makes his deal, there's all, in other words, that it requires Mashicha, that the seller can basically walk away from the deal if there's no Mashicha by the buyer. So too, there is Mashicha by the buyer, that the buyer is the one who can renege until he takes the chayfetz. Okay, so what are we being mechadish here? We're basically saying that Rish Lakish wants to interpret Mashicha as a benefit to both the seller and the buyer. So therefore, he makes that distinction between Reb Shimon and the Tanakama, that according to the Tanakama, there is Mashicha for the seller and the buyer, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, there isn't. Says the Gemara, Reb Shimon less paid Rav Chizda, and Rav Shimon does not hold of Rav Chizda's view. Rabbanon, who also Rav Chizda, and the rabbis hold Rav Chizda's view. So it's pretty much saying what we've said, but with a little bit of a twist. Here the kasha is, how do you understand Rabbi Yochanan? How does he interpret the machlokes between Reb Shimon and the Tanakama? Says the Gemara, you know what the chiluk is? The chiluk is Rav Chizda's interpretation of our Gemara. And what's Rav Chizda's interpretation? Rav Chizda comes to tell us that really everybody holds of Mashicha, that Mos Konos, but Mashicha is midrabanan, but everybody holds of it. What does it mean everybody holds of it? The Tanakama says that Mashicha helps both the buyer and the seller, for what we said before. It helps the buyer because he has not yet closed on the deal, so he doesn't have to worry about the chayfetz being lost. It protects the seller because the seller can receive the appreciation, but also he can undo the deal if he sees that the property is about to be destroyed. He can quickly undo the deal and say, it's not mine, it's yours, you take the loss. So he will want Mashicha, according to this interpretation, the seller will want Mashicha to be his sort of safety valve, if you will, that he'll be able to taina, there was no Mashicha, it's not mine, it's not my loss. That's pshat in the machlokes between Reb Shimon and the Tanakama. But according to so this is what, but Rav Shimon himself doesn't hold like Rav Chizda. Rav Shimon, who says at Yoda al Elyona that it's only a one-sided affair, only the mocher can renege, the buyer can't renege, he's going to say no. I don't hold of Rav Chizda that Mashicha helps both parties. Yeah, Mashicha may help. I'm only saying that Mashicha helps the seller. It doesn't help the buyer. The buyer is locked in because no matter what, he's already, because Mos Konos, therefore I hold that he's locked in. But if you hold like Rish Lakish, then Mashicha can help the buyer. But Reb Shimon says, I don't hold like that. So it's very interesting because I think we've had this discussion before. When two Tanoim argue or have a dispute, okay, machlokes Tanoim, and one takes one view, the Tanakama, Reb Shimon takes another view. When the Amoraim come to try to extrapolate what the Tanoim are saying, then we can say, obviously this Gemara is saying it, the Tanoim have the right to come back and say, I don't hold of that Tana's view. You would think, right, on par, you would think the Tanoim are the Tanoim, they're the ones who introduce the law, the halacha, in the Mishnah, and then come the Amoraim and they give commentary. But the Amoraim don't come to slug up the Tanoim. Here we have a circumstance where Rab Shimon, okay, he's a Tana, and he says, you know what? I don't hold of what Rav Chizda, his interpretation, that Mashiach works both ways. I'm imposing my view as a Tana. I'm imposing my view that only the mocher benefits, not the buyer. Whereas the Tanna Kama says they both have equal access, he's saying no. So this is where the circumstance where we see where the Amoira is trying to sort of pacify the machlokes, and the Tana says, I don't buy it. And it happens, I mean, not always, but it certainly happens where the Tanoim say, I don't hold of that Amora's interpretation, because this Amora is now coming to try to solve the problem, and I don't hold of it. Again, it's a fascinating discussion, because that's how the halacha and the Gemara work, is that the Mishnah, the Amora comes to try to explain the Mishnah, but the Tana doesn't have to agree with the Amora. He doesn't have to agree with that interpretation, according to him, and that is where we're left with. So we're basically left with a machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rab Shimon, but that machlokes only is a machlokes in Rish Lakish. It's not a machlokes in Rabbi Yochanan, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, both the Tanna Kama and Rab Shimon agree that what's it called, the meicher has yoda al Eliona, and the buyer cannot make any changes. According to Rabbi Lakish, he can. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he cannot. So it's a little bit of an interesting dichotomy in this Gemara. Okay, so and we did the last Rashi. I think we'll stop here because the next sugya picks up on something else in the Mishnah. But basically now that's kind of how we settle the machlokes between Rab Shimon and the Tanna Kama, based on the differences of view of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish as to whether or not the buyer has any say in the matter. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he has no say in the matter, and according to Rish Lakish, he does have a say in the matter, and therefore the machlokes between Rab Shimon and the Tanna Kama is more crystal, it's more clear. According to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no machlokes between Rab Shimon and the Tanna Kama, because they all hold the same. Because once you say that Moses Konos, then there's no wiggle room. The buyer has no say in the matter whatsoever, and therefore Yada al Yona, says Rab Shimon, his hand is he's always in control. And by the way, this last piece of the Mishnah, Rab Shimon, it disputes everything we've said for the last month or two in discussing this Mishnah, because what did we basically say? The Mishnah is telling us that Mos ain't a konos, that money cannot be kona. You have to have you have to have the chayfetz transferring rishus in order for a deal to be done. Money can't do it. Comes Rab Shimon and he upends his view, and he's a Tana. His view is no, Mos konos. Again, you know, we kind of settled the fact, and we asked whether money can be chalipa, and we went through all these gradations of whether or not money can somehow make a deal. And at the end, we say, no, money can't make a deal. And Rab Shimon comes and says, yes, I hold like Rabbi Yochanan, Mos konos midaraisa. Okay, so anyway, that's how we ended.
Just for clarification, Robert, you're not literally saying that a Tana can come and say, I don't agree with an interpretation of an Amora. I mean, normally the Tana would be long dead by that time. You're talking about that the Amora's
interpretation, yeah,
is projecting backwards towards
exactly.
So it's not literally happening, but
so the Mora is saying, right, that the Tana could never agree with me because exactly. I mean, you're talking about what, maybe 100 years, or I mean, whatever the time distance was from the Amoraim. But yes, but when Teres Chaim is, we talk about the Torah being alive, that the Tana can talk to the Amora can talk to the Tana, because that's how in our Lashon, it's all alive. But yeah, as a practical matter, you're right that the Tana was no longer there, but his view can no longer fit with the view that the Amora wants to pose, later on. Exactly. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah. So, Mr. We'll stop here, and we'll pick up Mitzvah next week.